Well, these wonderful, wonderful words of Scripture from Genesis, they conjure up this song from my swing choir days in high school. Maybe some of you know it as that Louis Armstrong classic, I see trees of green, red roses too, I see them bloom for me and you. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. So these opening words of the creation story in Genesis, they're a familiar story to almost all of us. And often in our valiant attempts to read the entire Bible in a specified amount of time, we confidently zip through this particular passage because its words are familiar and comforting. Now, for some of us, the creation account recalls the overly interpretive illustrations from children's Bibles or felt board Sunday school materials with the very modest Adam and Eve and uncharacteristically happy animals. Others recall that glorious image of the creation of Adam that covers the Sistine Chapel. Still others might recall a crisis of faith when juxtaposing the creation account with the content of high school biology. But for this week, I'm asking all of us to just set those images aside as we take a fresh look at the text. You see, the ancient Israelites had never heard of feltboard, nor had they heard the concept of evolution. Rather, in ancient Israel, the Genesis story would have likely been compared to other accounts of the origin of the world. There were many, many ancient Near Eastern creation narratives that were unapologetically polytheistic, meaning many gods. So there were a lot of them, and they each had changing roles and forms. The big one, Marduk, was associated with water and vegetation, eventually with magic, and was considered the head of the pantheon of Middle Eastern gods. Assur was leader of a rival pantheon in northern Mesopotamia. And then back in Egypt, a whole different set of gods quarreled over legitimacy, beginning with Osiris and Seth, and then Seth and Horus. And every single one of those major pantheons had hundreds of lesser deities contending for prominence or even for survival. And those deities were really, really fickle. According to the Babylonian myth, Enuma Elish, they created humans, or at least some of them did, but at the same time, they later regretted that decision and schemed to destroy the human race because we were too, anyone guess why? We were too noisy. And those deities would battle, kill, enslave, and retaliate against each other, and humans were often caught in the middle of those disputes. So within this cultural narrative, the creation account at the beginning of Genesis presents a completely different picture of the world's origins. First of all, in the creation story that we heard today, God is sovereign and powerful. God says, and it happens. God, you see, doesn't have this singular area of competence, but rather God is the creator God of all things, from the creations of heaven and the earth, space between the sky and the water, between dry land and sea, day and night. Or in the words of the song that I loved, I see skies of blue and clouds of white, the bright, blessed day, the dark, sacred night, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. So as well as creating the cosmos, God also creates the animal and vegetable life, which would have been extraordinarily meaningful for an agrarian society like ancient Israel. And most significantly, Genesis provides a unique account of the relationship between humans and the divine. Somehow, God decides to make humans in our image according to our likeness. Of course, understanding the precise theological nature of image and likeness in Genesis is elusive. I'm guessing that is probably deliberate. But minimally, I think we can infer that humans were not created out of the capricious whim of certain deities, but rather we stand sort of as the pinnacle of the creation event. And after the creation of humans, God, in God's powerful word, blesses them and declares them very good. And then we can sing, "The colors of the rainbow, so pretty in the sky, are also on the faces of people going by." I see friends shaking hands, saying, "How do you do?" They're really saying, "I love you." I hear babies cry. I watch them grow. They'll learn much more than I'll ever know. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. Yes. I think to myself, what a wonderful world. Friends, creation is considered by God to be an amazing blessing, a work of art, very good. In fact, looking at creation in progress, God saw that it was good 5 times and then found it very good after the 6th day. And we all need to know that this wonderful thing called life is going somewhere, and somewhere good. It's going someplace good because it came from goodness, a beginning of original blessing, instead of perhaps what we have more commonly heard and referred to as the concept of original sin. For some reason, most Christian theology seems to start with Genesis 3 instead of Genesis 1, which features Adam and Eve, what Augustine would centuries later call original sin. And when you start with a negative or with a problem, it's not surprising that you end with Armageddon and apocalypse. When you start with a punitive, critical, exclusionary God, it's not surprising that you would see crucifixion as substitutionary atonement, where Jesus takes the punishment that this angry God intended for us. That sounds more like those Mesopotamian gods than it does about the God we read about in the creation story. Now, not all Christians believe the story that way, nor does it square with what the loving Father of Jesus would do. So if we don't believe that Jesus came to appease an angry God, then some might ask, well, then why did Jesus come? One of my favorite lines is, Jesus did not come to change the mind of God about humanity. It didn't need changing. God has organically and inherently loved what God created from the moment God created it. Rather, Jesus came to change the mind of humanity about God, to show us how to live in this wonderful world that God has created that somehow we got all messed up. And as our image of God changes, our image of God's creation, including ourselves, changes as well. Jesus shows us what it looks like for God to be incarnate in humanity. And he holds together the human and the divine that is shown so beautifully in the creation story so that we might follow him and do the same. And Jesus shows us that the pattern of everything is death and resurrection. You see, Jesus is the archetypal pattern for every life, including yours and mine. There will be suffering and death, along with love and joy and resurrection. And most of us are so resistant to accepting suffering that Jesus walked through it himself and said, "Follow me." He showed us that on the other side of suffering is transformation, that love is stronger than death, and the full, vibrant life that Jesus offers is big enough to include even its opposite, death. Unless a religion directly faces the issue of suffering and death, it really is a rather useless religion because every single one of us faces that. Jesus holds those big questions front and center, and those questions guide us into a life of blessing and peace. So this idea of original blessing begins with goodness, with compassion, with creativity at the heart of the universe. And it embraces the best of both religion and science. And when I think about Christianity through this lens of creation, spirituality, and original blessing, one of the most exciting implications is the potential to catalyze our progress as individuals and society from sort of an infantile egocentrism, in which we selfishly only care about our needs, to ethnocentrism or tribalism, in which we only care about the needs of people who are similar to ourselves, to globocentrism, in which we both embrace the common humanity of all humans and the place of humanity as merely one among many important parts of planet Earth. And finally, we can get to cosmocentrism, in which we truly begin to view an integrated perspective that takes into account our place as an interdependent part in an ongoing 13.7 billion-year-old and counting, unfolding creation is the universe story. A shorthand description of that process would be to move from me to we to all of us to all. And it's a shift in thinking, framing all that we know as blessing, spirituality, and the universe story as a whole, rather than the earth as a place of sinfulness, original sin, and a fall redemption story, although we all know that as a human race, we fall extremely short of God's expectation for us and constantly need the grace and mercy that God offers us. Now, not everyone has a desire to make this shift in perspective. And certainly, if you are one of them, you are not alone in the Christian world, and your worldview is respected and acknowledged by me and by many. Indeed, in some ways, this sort of new perspective, which is actually all quite ancient, the more you look into it, can seem to be somewhat a profound break with Christianity and reality, as we've been taught to understand it. However, consider the story of the philosopher who was asked, "Why did people used to think that the sun went round the earth?" One of his students said, "Because it looks as if the sun goes around the earth." The philosopher responded, "But how would it look if the earth went round the sun?" The answer is, it would look exactly the same. Think about it. Analogously, someone could ask, why do some people believe in original sin and a fall redemption story of creation? Another might respond, because it looks as if original sin and a fall redemption story are the case. But the questioner could retort, what would it look like if original blessing, creation spirituality, and the universe story were the case? And the answer is that the world would look exactly the same in many ways. The difference in both cases is our worldview, what we want to know, and what we are able to give ourselves permission to experience, to think, and to consider. So my invitation is for us to really think for ourselves during the next 6 weeks. Think to ourselves, what a wonderful world, and just see where that leads.